I Barely Got Here is a collection of stories and conversations based on 24 years in law enforcement. You have the right to be disturbed by some of the content or disagree with the viewpoints. Anything you hear can and will be dosed with sarcasm and dark humor. You have the right to know that discussions will often be graphic with language and themes that are intended for a mature audience. Do you understand your rights? Then buckle up, Buttercup. We're going 10-8. Welcome back to I Barely Got Here, and I'm your host, Kevin Booncher. And I'm happy to say I got Jay in here with me again in the studio to give us another great story. If you want to say, hey, Jay.
Good morning, Kevin.
As you know, as you have been listening to the podcast at all, you know that Jay has got some really good stories. In addition to, he's just a good storyteller. So I love doing this stuff with him. And, he's one of my good friends. So it's great to see him and chat with him and catch up. So today we got a story that is from after retirement. It's during his PI days, which technically he's still in his PI days. We're just going to get into it. I don't have a lot of involvement on this one. This is actually one where I get to sit back and listen to this, kind of like some of his other stories, but I'll definitely ask questions. So without further ado, tonight's episode is Fossil Creek. So Jay, I'm just going to turn it over to you and let you unwind this thing.
All right. Well, as in most of my PI work, it usually begins with a phone call from a lawyer requesting some help on a particular case that he may be dealing with, he or she may be dealing with. And this Fossil Creek case involves a murder and actually had a tie to the Rolling Stones magazine as well as America's Most Wanted television show. So it was a pretty interesting, long, drawn-out case that was very consequential and had some, real tragedy involved in it as well. So this particular case began when a deer hunter in Arizona, an archery hunter in Arizona, discovered a body in Fossil Creek. Fossil Creek is a remote area in kind of the high plateau deserty area of Arizona. It's not forested. It's more scrubby and desert area at about, I want to say maybe about 70 or 80 miles north of Phoenix metro area, but far enough and it's remote and it's hard to get back there. It's beautiful once you get back there, but it is a pretty remote trip, which we did this summer. And I suggest that if you're ever asked to do it, you take somebody else's car. you will beat your vehicle up, whatever you're driving. So I won't do that again. But anyway, the hunter discovered a body that was a man that was dead, and he was sitting in half in the creek and half out of Fossil Creek. He looked like his shirt had been burned off his body. He was soaking what used to be fingers, in the creek, cooling his fingers off, but that's how this man died. And Yavapai County Sheriff's Department handled the initial investigation into the murder. This is obviously a murder. It wasn't, a natural cause.
Wasn't suicide.
Wasn't suicide. No, you don't kill yourself the way this man died.
Right.
So they had done a very good, they actually did a really good investigation, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department that handled it. But I got involved when the attorney that I had a relationship with, his law firm, or he had been contacted by the family of one of the murder suspects in this case, and they had asked for some legal stick handling and to handle this particular matter.
Yeah.
And he was the second attorney that was contacted because the first attorney was going to charge $750,000 to represent this kid in this crime, and it was a capital murder case, and the consequences were significant of losing or at least mitigating some of his damage, it was life or death, for his end too. So that's how I became involved in the case.
Okay.
So my initial involvement usually requires, reading paperwork, whatever may be out there. And in a murder case, you understand this, but maybe some of your listeners don't understand that there's just a ton of material to read. There's just nobody witnessed this happen. Well, 3 people witnessed this happen, 4, including the victim.
Yeah.
But at the time, there were just a deer hunter, whoever he was with, the investigation that Yavapai County had done in the crime scene, evidence to go over. And in this particular case, it became a bit more convoluted because the murder victim, his first name was Constantine, happened to be involved in another criminal investigation being handled by Phoenix PD. So it was a real messy situation.
Yeah, and so I would imagine that the first implication or the first thought would be that this death must have had something to do with that Phoenix investigation, correct?
Exactly.
I mean, that would be your logical step.
Right.
And I will step back when you're talking about getting pulled into a case like this, especially a large-scale case, and you talk about review of evidence. It is hours and upon hours of reading and watching video, if that exists, listening to audio, whatever the case may be. And as Jay knows better than I, but there's often times when you're reviewing these mounds of information that people haven't even seen it. The attorney hasn't seen it. The cops basically saw it, but it got glossed over. So a lot of times what our job is to pick through the entire pile of information, because sometimes there's a hidden gem in there that helps the client.
Right. And that's most lawyers that retain me, and I'm sure you too, they enjoy having a different perspective, a different set of eyes on their discovery, on their work product. They're not their work product, but law enforcement's work product that they have access to and is provided to them. They just like us to look at it and say, what do you see?
And we understand it better than they do in a lot of cases as well, just because we are on that side of the coin.
Yeah, and in this particular case, the murder victim was actually an informant for Phoenix PD, which complicated matters even more. There was a crime involving an allegation of Russian mafia or the Russian mob, and there was a presence of some Russian organized crime here in the valley, in Phoenix metro area. And so the detective that was kind of the control officer, the control agent, or I don't know if that's the right term, whoever was handling that informant for the
handler.
The handler, whoever was handling that informant for the other matter, happened to he just kind of not bled, but these cases overlapped one another. So this detective actually recognized that it was his informant that was dead through a statewide bulletin that was put out with some identifying marks on the body, some tattoos that were distinctive. They couldn't fingerprint the guy because he had no fingers, so they couldn't print him and run him. And really, prints are only good if you're in a database to begin with, so then they can identify you. But this particular detective identified this murder victim through his receipt and review of the tattoo.
So how'd you, again, because, we both handled, so to speak, informants, CIs, or whatever the case. So how'd you like to be cruising through like some bulletins and all of a sudden see stuff that identifies your CI as now being dead?
He was looking for it because what we haven't discussed yet was the day before this man was murdered, he was actually on the telephone talking to his informant about some things. So whatever.
With that case?
With the original. They're all separated, the two. We'll talk. Well, one is Fossil Creek and one is a Scottsdale armed robbery.
Yeah, okay.
So he was on the phone talking to him, and the detective was out of state talking to his informant, and he heard a struggle that could be heard through his end of the telephone. And then the phone went dead. And he had tried calling back, couldn't get through. He had tried to have his guys that were here in Phoenix go find Constantine.
Check on him.
I think something bad happened to him. Something has happened to him. So he had been AWOL. He had been absent from any discussions with his informant for 4 or 5 days prior to the body being discovered. And I don't remember how long it took before the tattoo went out statewide. Normally there's a lagging time to documents get prepared and they come up with a strategy to disseminate the information. So it takes a while. But nevertheless, he identified eventually, he connected the Fossil Creek murder victim with his informant.
I wonder if he knew that he was actually catching the beginning of this guy's getting killed with that phone call.
He didn't at the time, but as soon as the body was discovered, he put two and two together, and he knew immediately what happened. Now, that in itself and the leap to the jump to the conclusion that he was sure who the murder suspects were, it kind of made a tragic case even more convoluted because Phoenix PD and this detective was sure that it involved these suspects from his Scottsdale armed robbery case that he was working that involved a pharmacy and $1 million worth of growth hormones that had been an investigation in a failed fraud scheme / robbery that whoever ordered this growth hormone was going to put together a crew to go hijack the drugs as they were being delivered to the pharmacy before they got there. So they could turn in $1 million claim for the value of the drugs, and then they could sell the drugs on the black market, to whoever wanted to get pumped up or whatever they were using it for.
Very confusing.
Very confusing.
But, as an investigator, as a cop in general, we know that most times crimes are solved through the most direct and obvious fashion.
Sure.
And I'm sure that we would have jumped to the same conclusion.
We would have thought the same.
Yeah, you'd have thought it's got to be tied to this.
Yeah.
Okay, so I am a little confused, though, on let's reconstruct the issue of his involvement with this Scottsdale robbery. So walk me through that a little bit more as to what role he played in that.
Constantine was one of 4 or 5 young men that had been solicited by whoever had orchestrated and came up with this brilliant idea to steal the drugs before it came into the door of their pharmacy.
Okay.
So, and I don't know how they were tied to one another, but apparently there was a connection. I think the 2 guys, if I remember correctly, the 2 guys in Scottsdale that were setting up, putting the crew together to do this, they were dating 2 strippers that were sisters, and they were Russian. So I think the stripper sisters had referred them to Constantine or somebody that knew Constantine.
Sure.
That's how he became one of 4 or 5 young men that were supposed to take down this either UPS driver or a FedEx truck as it delivered the drugs. And it went bad, and there was enough evidence developed where people could be charged in that case in Scottsdale. And since the Phoenix Russian-speaking detective that had his finger on the pulse of the Russian community here in the Valley, he had kind of got involved too, since he spoke Russian for one thing, and it was easier for him to.
Sure.
So he had signed this kid up to be an informant, and so he was basically snitching, providing the detective with the information of the HDH robbery. And then so the detective was on the phone with Constantine, talking about the robbery when, unbeknownst to him, he was being kidnapped for a completely different reason.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So the crux of that pharmacy issue was they were going to bring in, let's just say, $1 million worth of drugs.
Yep.
But before it came into their shop, it was going to get stolen by this RIP crew who would take the drugs. Pharmacy files an insurance claim to get compensated for the loss of their drugs, but then they would still take all these drugs that were stolen by their own RIP crew, and then they would sell those as well.
I mean, they had tremendous profit and
double
no overhead.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Got it. Makes sense.
So that was the brilliant idea in Scottsdale put together.
Okay.
That never happened. The HC8 was successfully delivered at some point. There was one attempt. It was failed. I think the driver either didn't believe somebody had a gun or told him to F off or something. There was something kind of comical about that. Yeah, just drove away.
Well, and you got to remember, you don't mess with those guys. I mean, those guys, they're pretty, I got a schedule to keep here, and I got to put stuff on doorsteps, and screw you and your gun, and off I go.
So it didn't happen. That never occurred, and that all crumbled, and people were charged with conspiracy, and I'm not sure how that ended. I wasn't involved in that investigation.
But so we come back to this poor Constantine, who is found dead up at Fossil Creek. Phoenix detective puts 2 and 2 together with regard to the tattoo dissemination, law enforcement bulletin. And then also, unfortunately, what a crappy feeling that had to be to know that you were in the conversation of when he was getting taken.
That'd be awful.
Yeah, that'd be a terrible. Yeah. That'd make me a little queasy. So he gets some idea, and where does it go from there?
Well, Phoenix, the Russian detective in Yavapai County certainly started communicating about who this victim was and their reasons or their ideas or speculation for him being where he was. And then also Phoenix, if I remember this correctly, was trying to go up on an emergency wiretap on the people that they suspected were involved in this. So there was somewhat of an infight that went on between the county attorney's office and Phoenix, and they never got their emergency wiretap on. Had they got it up and running, they would have been listening to their own guys, because it turned out that Constantine, he owed other people some money on a far lesser scale than $1 million heist. He owed a guy some money here in the Valley, another Russian young man here in the Valley.
Okay, now, and is this what's kind of leading and preceding his death?
It is.
Okay.
It is. Discussing the murder, it turns out that Constantine apparently owed a debt, and it wasn't that significant. The value of his debt, according to whoever felt he owed the money to him, was equivalent of the car that Constantine was driving.
Convenient.
It was very convenient. So he had, probably a $5,000 Acura or whatever he had back then. That the brilliant scam that the younger masterminds had come up with was to drive Constantine around, go with Constantine to these title loan corner title loan quickie, get your money quick, get a lien on your title to get the money that was owed to him. So they began, 3 young men and Constantine began traveling around the valley trying to find an outfit that would loan them money on the car. So there was what turned out to be my client. His name is Chris, and another young man by the name of Sukhanov. I don't remember his first name.
I'm assuming another Russian.
Another Russian. Mike Chris.
Yours was not.
Mike. No, my client was not Russian. He was from the East Coast.
Okay, so we've got Constantine. We've got 2 Russian guys that basically feel Constantine owes them money. And then we got your kid, Chris.
Right.
So how did Chris get involved with these guys?
Chris had run into these kids when, and I say kids, they're young men, when he came out to go to ASU. He came out here when he graduated from high school. He came out to attend ASU. He liked cocaine. And so at some point his paths crossed with a man named Mikhail Drachev and Sukhanov and even Constantine, and then my client Chris, which was kind of the odd man out, but their common ground with one another was all drug related.
Got it.
And so that's how they formed their relationship with one another. And unfortunately, my client wasn't living on campus where he made in Tempe. He was living way across town at like Indian School and the freeway, I-17 freeway, which had the influence of Mikhail Drachev and
it's kind of their area.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's how, and so geographically, I think that's how they found a way to one another, as well as a line of Coke and a straw.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
But anyway, they spent a day going around trying to get this, and they couldn't complete the loan because Constantine then had never retitled the car into his name or something. He had an open title on it. So they even at one point went back to MBD in Tempe and sat there for hours trying to get it retitled, but then Constantine didn't have his ID to prove that he was really Constantine. So it was just a whole comedy of errors.
Right.
I mean, it was one mistake after another. So MBD was closing. It was approaching 5 o'clock. There was no money that they could get out of the title loan companies. So they decided to all go back to Chris's apartment and just, they were going to keep Constantine for the night to make sure he was still available the next morning when they went back with MVD with his ID to get this started. Sure. So at some point, they ended up, all 4 of them in my client's apartment in Phoenix. That's when the Phoenix detective called Constantine, just a random call to reconnect from him. And that's when these kids had decided that they didn't want Constantine to go home that night. So they decided to hang on to him.
Okay. So the big, the call that we discussed earlier is now just going to occur because initially what did they do? Just basically say, hey, you owe us this money, so come on along with us because we're going to get a title loan so you can help pay us back. So
and he acknowledged the debt.
He was kind of a witting.
Yeah, it was a voluntary.
Exactly.
I'm sure it wasn't what he wanted to do on a Thursday, but that's, he owed him money.
Right.
And
he still went along with it. So
did.
it was at the time that they went back to the apartment, it was when they were going to kind of give him you're not going to go anywhere. And then the phone call coincided and da-da-da.
At the exact moment they said, hello, hi, how are you?
Wow.
One detective to his Russian informant.
Right.
Crap started to happen. And there was a physical confrontation in there. He could hear a scuffle. Blows were thrown. Somebody was thumped. And eventually Constantine was duct taped and thrown in a closet.
I'm assuming somebody just hung his phone up and let it.
That was it. That was his slumber party. They just decided to spend the night, and Constantine in the closet and these other 3 idiots in the front room.
Right. A little uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Jiminy. Okay, so now we've transitioned from, I owe you a debt. I'm sure it was some kind of funky dope debt or whatever, but to, kidnap.
Sure.
restrained,
They
assaulted.
have committed a Class 2 felony.
Right.
You know, a
right.
serious
It's
crime.
definitely serious. They definitely stepped up the game
They
at
did.
that point. So, all right. So they throw him in a closet, and he has a miserable night, I'm sure, in there.
Right.
And then what happens?
Well, these three geniuses then continued to discuss what they should do, and at some point, they thought it'd be good to have a gun with them. Whatever course of action they were going to do the next day, they needed to get their hand on a gun. So one of them went out in search of a gun that night, either through Craigslist or Backpage or whatever forum that was used to sell guns, private party. One of them ended up bringing a handgun back to the apartment, and then they continued to ruminate, discuss what was going to happen the next day. And I don't know what their discussions were that next day, because I don't know what Mikhail Drachev had discussed, or Sukhanov, and even my own client. What your listeners have to understand is when we represent somebody in a criminal event like this, a crime, a serious crime, we often are sequestered and we're kind of carved out away from any real intimate conversations that a lawyer is having with his client.
Yeah.
You know, and especially in a murder case, I've discovered that over the years, that there is less open dialogue. Now I became familiar with all the reports and everything, but I can't tell you what the three of them discussed. Other than the next morning, they decided they were going to abandon the car title idea, and they told Constantine they were going to drive him to Mexico and just drop him off on the other side of Mexico. Another drop-off. I think we had a previous, another drop-off. So they were going to take him to the border. They were actually going to drive him across the border and take him to Mexico, untape him, let him go, and then they were going to come up here.
Which makes no sense. I mean, what's the point of that? It's a lot of wasted time and energy. They still have no money. So obviously, I mean, if you're even quasi-smart, you're thinking, okay, this don't sound right.
And you don't really need a gun to drive a man to Mexico.
No.
So, so...
It was just an excuse.
It was. So
lame one.
So the next morning, they got Constantine out of bed, out of the closet, and then they kind of duck walked him. He was taped up in front. They put a jacket over his head and walked him when the sun was coming out. And they stuffed him in the cargo area of a Jeep Cherokee and stuffed him in there, slammed the door shut, and all three of them got into the Jeep Cherokee, and they drove north instead of south. They went. Mexico is not north of Phoenix,
right.
So they head northbound on the freeway, and
But of course, Constantine has no clue.
He didn't. He was. I think he was blindfolded, certainly taped and
totally
bound
disoriented,
bound and gagged, and tucked away in the cargo area.
Right.
Went up to Camp Verde, which is maybe halfway between here and Flagstaff, for 50 or 60 miles north of town, and got off the freeway, got gas, even put gas in like a gas jug, that they had in the back, and then they drove to the Fossil Creek area that you opened your podcast with.
So I wonder, did you ever find out why they went there? Did any of them have any prior experience or?
They had been there, like I discussed going there in the summer with you, and I'd never take that. It's real beautiful back in that area. So I think at some point, and it's very secluded, it's real hard to get to. So I think it's just because somebody had been back there to swim in the creek or swing off a rope. Somebody was familiar with that area and the seclusion and the privacy that it brought.
And you would think so. I mean, for you to just start driving down dirt roads is pretty random. So.
Yeah, one of them had been there before.
Got it.
It wasn't my client. I think it was Sukhanov or Drachev. Yeah. But anyway, they pulled off the side of this dirt washboard road, and they got him out of the car. He looked around at his environment when he was there, and he goes,
"This ain't Mexico."
This ain't Mexico.
Oh, jeez.
He was fully aware that, he was someplace. It was pretty chilly, if I remember right. There was a bit of a bite in the nighttime. The air.
Sure.
So he was he knew he wasn't in Mexico.
Yeah.
And they marched him down to the creek. Who did what? I will never be able to say. Only what came out in trial, will I be able to say, because my client never confessed anything he did specifically. And so what I'm going to tell you guys is basically what was revealed
Came out.
in trial.
Yeah.
And so they marched him down to the creek, and at that point, Constantine was pleading for his life. They gave him a last cigarette. They actually allowed him, I think they moved his hands around to the front. They restrained him in the front, gave him a cigarette, allowed him to have his cigarette, and then they, according to testimony, Mikhail Drachev pulled out the gun and pointed it at him and pulled the trigger.
And?
Nothing happened. So they had, he racked another round, worked the slide, dumped the slide, did a failure drill as best a guy with no experience could.
Right.
And I rechambered another round, fired, squeezed again, and nothing again happened. Turned out later that we discovered that that gun had the firing pin removed from it, so it would never function.
Oh, geez.
And so then at that point...
how'd you like to be Constantine at that point?
Well, he felt he had an opportunity at that point. Maybe it was destined that he'd be released. So,
True.
Apparently he pled some more for his life. And then Mikhail Drachev, according to the story that has been reported, stabbed him, repeatedly, and killed him with a knife. So everybody went back to the truck, abandoning a body by the creek. And they went back to their Jeep Cherokee. Mikhail got the gas can that they had filled up in Camp Verde, brought it back down to the creek with what I've been told the other two young men staying at the Jeep. And Mikhail Drachev went down there and doused the body with gasoline and lit him on fire, but Constantine wasn't dead.
Oh, geez.
So then he...
As evidenced by what? What happened?
The screams that the two guys in the Jeep waiting for Mikhail Drachev to come back to them were hearing, as well as Mikhail running back to the Jeep, let's go. And they all drove out of there knowing that they had done something really bad.
Well, yeah. Holy cow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty disturbing. Yeah, so this poor guy, he's almost got shot, but the gun didn't work.
Right.
And then he pleads some more for his life. Now he gets stabbed multiple times. So what was he unconscious and the fire woke him up, or was he faking, or what do you think?
We think both. We think, he could have been unconscious and then, came to, but more than likely he was just feigning death.
Right.
He'd been stabbed repeatedly, but you can't really fake it once you're set on fire. You're not going to fake that. It's not going to be it was brutal.
Yeah, that's horrible.
Yeah, it was horrible.
And so probably out of fear, probably out of God knows what else reason, that guy just basically runs away from him as he's screaming and howling and on fire. And then how does he... So essentially, I'm assuming that he crawled his way down to the river or the creek.
He did. He crawled, a couple hundred yards, about 100 yards away from where, it looked like by the evidence supported the fact that he was probably stabbed and burned here.
Right.
But the body wasn't found for 4 days after this crime committed. It was found 4 days later.
Right.
But he had managed to be 100 or 200 yards down the creek or up the creek. I can't remember if it was up or down, but it was a ways away. His clothes had been pretty much burnt off him, and the restraints around his wrist had been burned off, and his fingers had been burned off, with him trying to put out the flames. And but he was soaking his hands in the creek when the deer hunters found him.
Wow. And think of that guy that found him, too. I mean, what a surreal... it'll be like something out of the movies.
I've seen all the crime scene photos, so I have a visual image of that, and it was worse than probably any crime scene I'd seen in 20 years of law enforcement.
Yeah.
So it was pretty brutal.
And burning is fire, a burning death, or to a body is just horrific. It just looks terrible.
Yeah.
And we've talked about odors and smells, but obviously photographs you don't have that. But
sure.
I just what a terrible, terrible scene.
Yeah, it was bad.
Ugh.
It was a bad scene.
Okay, so he unfortunately is in the creek. Russian guy runs back to the Jeep. They all take off, and what happens from there?
All three of them travel back to Phoenix the way they went. It's one way in, one way out, journey.
Right.
And then when they get to Phoenix, Mikhail and Chris, they stick together, and Sukhanov goes his own way. I don't remember Sukhanov's first name, but I do know he wanted to be an Abercrombie and Fitch model. So he's a real pretty boy. He was a good-looking young man.
Sure.
And So he stayed here. He had family here. The other two, Mikhail and Chris, jumped in a vehicle. I think they bought a Mercedes, off of Craigslist that the next day or something, and then they drove back to the East Coast, where they ended up at Chris's parents' house for them just pulling in one evening unannounced.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, Mom, hi, Dad.
Right. I drop in for a bit.
Can we spend the night? That's my friend Mikhail. So, and that's pretty much what happened.
Right.
And by the time they got there, the body hadn't even been discovered yet.
Yeah.
And then when Mom and Dad woke up the next day, they discovered their son and Mikhail was missing, as was $10,000 of cash missing from their safe. And so he had gone to, they didn't know where he'd gone to, so they left. And where they had gone to was they had separated from one another shortly after that. And Mikhail went into Canada. I think he went to Toronto or Montreal, and presumably back to Russia is what everybody thought for years and years, that he was in Russia. And Chris, he fled to Europe. He actually flew, I think, to London, and then he ended up in Spain. So he was in Spain. I think it was a week or two later, some press had come to the attention, or some article had come to the attention of Chris's mom or mom and dad, who were very upstanding members of the community where they lived in, and a bit affluent, and somebody had brought it to their attention that their son was being named as one of 3 murder suspects in this murder that we're talking about.
So I'll back you up a little bit. So how did they identify these 3 guys as having been involved in this guy's murder?
An Abercrombie and Fitch model isn't a very strong. I guess he didn't stand.
He didn't stay real tight-lipped.
He didn't keep it a secret. So somehow Phoenix PD or somehow law enforcement had found their way to Suganov, and he had told his version of the story, which included minimizing his involvement, but describing who his companions were with during this particular murder.
As they all do. They always minimize. More than likely, he probably ran his mouth, because those guys never keep quiet.
Right.
So I'm sure that got around to it. And I do want a disclaimer: we have nothing against the intelligence of Abercrombie Fitch models.
Absolutely,
I just
not.
want to say that.
No. Or the Russian community in our valley.
Well, sure.
Around here too. There's just it was just a weird.
So Abercrombie Fitch guy spills the beans.
He spills the
basically.
beans, and then at that point, the search goes nationwide looking for the 2 that were absent and missing. So they were trying to find them. And I think about that same time, there was some news articles. They knew geographically where Chris lived, where he came from. And so if there was a story or some press, made it back to the East Coast, and then it was brought to the attention of the parents. And then the parents then began their quest to find their son by, email, and it turned out that they did begin communicating with him in a little internet cafe out of Spain. And then he denied any involvement, in the situation, and at the advice of his mom and dad, who then began trying to find an attorney for their son in the States, in Arizona.
Right.
They had began their quest to find the proper legal fit for them here to represent their son. And they went to one man who bid $750,000, and then they went to a man that I had done battle with in law enforcement, but I had actually done work for him, in the private sector, and then they retained him. And they decided to have their son, they told their son that they had legal counsel retained. They asked him to meet him in London. They flew to Heathrow, and then they met at a place that they were familiar with. This kid had traveled the world, so he was quite wealthy and quite, educated.
Sure. And familiar with all that.
Oh, very familiar
territory.
with his globetrotting. And then mom and dad flew there, and then from there they flew to Sky Harbor and were met by Phoenix PD, and their son was arrested.
Okay.
And then the case then just gets in the system, and we just begin that long process of working our way either to a plea agreement or a trial. In this case, we ended up going all the way to a trial.
So why do you think it went to trial? Why do you think none of these guys took a plea? Were they just continually blaming the others?
Well, Mikhail Dodgev was gone. So
Right.
with him being gone, I think it was real easy for everybody still to put more blame on the guy that was absent.
Got it.
And the pleas that were being offered, I mean, when you deal with this brutal murder the way it happened, you're obviously looking at a death penalty type case.
Yeah.
And so the pleas were just not acceptable.
Yeah.
Sukhanov accepted a plea, and his plea was probably life, in prison, but he avoided the death penalty by
Right.
accepting the plea. So then he turned into a cooperating witness for the government who would tell his version to the government, and he would have to stick pretty close to the first version he told the government. And then our client certainly had a different version of events.
Sure.
If he was even going to make it, if we were even going to sponsor him as a witness to let him tell his version of events.
So, when you talk about that, I mean, again, the problem is we'll never know the true version of what occurred. So what you told us occurred is probably the most accurate of what you think from your involvement?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think because a lot of what I'm telling you is through my memory of reports and then I sat through a 9-week, murder trial with
Which is a pretty lengthy trial.
It's a very long trial.
Yeah.
And it was 9 weeks and then another week on the penalty phase. I wasn't there for the penalty phase, but so it was a very involved, very lengthy trial.
Yeah.
So my recounting this story comes from kind of a meshing of personal contact and what I witnessed.
Sure.
Which is public knowledge. If you were to read the transcript, it's out in the public domain what happened. So we had a 9-week trial.
So what was the final for the three guys again? You said Sukhanov got life.
Sukhanov got life in prison. Our client, after a 9-week trial, was found guilty. And then he was spared the death penalty. So his life in prison, which, I have to interject this at this point. I had kind of a hard time accepting the fact that my squeaky clean young man client was accused or even involved in the things, that he is accused of doing.
Right.
And I'm an evidence-based guy. I believe in evidence, so I can't argue the fact that it was there. And it isn't that I believe that he was innocent. It was I had a huge disconnect in looking at the man that was seated between me and his attorney for 9 weeks and looking at this guy, even putting him at that crime scene, it was hard for me to understand that, especially since, he was younger than my children and cleaner cut.
Yeah.
He was very clean cut.
Well, and look at all he had his whole life ahead of him, and he had a very charmed life.
Everything going
Already.
for him.
He had everything.
He had sailed the ocean in sailboats, traveled the world. He was very easy to talk to. It was just I had a big disconnect in the crime and then the young man that was sitting beside me. But after 9 weeks, he was found guilty and spared, the death penalty. And so he's in prison, and the system worked. So but Mikhail Dodgev was gone. He still this happened. Gosh, I can't remember. This may have happened 12, 15 years ago that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Maybe 15 or maybe 17 years ago. He was on the lam. He was a fugitive for probably 10 years.
Wow.
Until law enforcement finally caught up to him.
Do you remember where?
I do. I don't remember where, other than Canada. He was still in Canada.
Oh.
And he was about a week or 2 weeks away from being married. And just by fluke of a coincidence, America's Most Wanted ran another story about Mikhail Dodgev and his involvement in this Constantine Fossil Creek murder. And his soon-to-be bride saw the episode of America's Most Wanted and saw her fiancé, who was going by a completely different name and a different backstory and identity, saw the man she loved as being named as the third suspect in a brutal murder in Arizona. So
wow.
She turned him in for the $100,000 reward. So
wow.
She saved herself. She made $100,000 from the reward money and from this case. And he ended up being arrested in Canada and ultimately extradited back to Phoenix. And he's in prison too.
Isn't that crazy though?
It was crazy.
That is just so crazy.
It was.
I mean, I know that, we've had cases profiled on America's Most Wanted
Right.
here and there. And, you know, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But God, what a great, I mean, okay, so take America's Most Wanted out of it. Probably never would have been caught, right?
Oh, I don't think so.
I think he'd have lived happily ever after with his new wife in Canada.
He could have. You know, I like to think eventually karma set things right and the world rights itself. But there are fugitives that's been out there forever. They'll die a natural a death. You know, there's so many crimes that go unsolved. So I was glad we had 2 out of the 3. You know, at least the family, Constantine's family, you know, could have some closure to this. But with McHale hanging out there the way he was and being on the lam for as long as he was, you know,
just stuck in your throat the whole time.
Yeah. And I mean, I was glad to hear that was tidied up and they finally got him. And his wife didn't find out, you know, years later when they had kids, discovered Daddy was a murderer out of Arizona.
God, that is just the craziest thing.
It was pretty bizarre.
Wow. Okay. Well, and once again, I think that, you know, the takeaway is that at least the system worked and, you know, this guy was killed in a terrible homicide, but at least the 3 guys got caught and they're done. One guy after a little while. 10 years is a long time.
10 years was a long time.
That is a long time.
And, and I track, in the state of Arizona, and probably every other state, you can see who the inmates are and what they're doing. And just out of curiosity, I kind of keep my finger on the pulse of my client to see where he's moved to and how he's doing. And he looks like he's having a pretty productive prison life.
Really?
He's tutoring, he's teaching, he was a very smart man. But drugs and
I was going to say drugs did him in.
Drugs have a way of just making smart men stupid.
Yeah, for sure.
Actually, he can see Mexico from where he's at, so he's almost in Mexico. He's down in Yuma right now.
Yeah.
And he's there's San Luis, and I haven't talked to him since I said goodbye, and he thanked me for what I had done as part of his case, and because I said goodbye the day the verdict came in, and haven't had any more involvement with him since then. I think his family's reached out to me a couple of times to tell me how their son is doing, and he's turned into quite an artist. I've seen some of his artwork, but I guess when you're in prison, you can tutor and draw.
Well, I mean, at least the guy's doing something positive versus the opposite of what some of these guys do. Yeah. So,
but you know. I mean, it was he's there for life.
Yeah,
he'll never get out. Wow. There's no chance of parole, and I think of him occasionally when I hear a parent sending their children off, you know, a long ways away for school, and when there's no network of support for them in the state or the city where they're going to. It's a bit frightening because I always hearken back to Chris.
Yeah, there's a lot of room to get in trouble, man.
A lot of room.
No reins.
Yeah, even no you know, eliminate the drugs. Just have that kind of freedom at that age of life.
Yes.
When you're so far away, is a very troubling combination of ingredients.
It's brand new and they're not mature yet. And well, you know, we saw, take this case out of it completely. How many young college kids did you see get themselves in some pretty serious trouble sometimes just for completely due to immaturity and, you know, again, no support.
Exactly.
No guidance, no parent,
right.
You know.
Yep.
Anyway, yeah, that's a great story. And like most of Jay's stories, I've heard the stories before, oftentimes when we were in our office and just BSing at the end of work, and I don't get to hear them in their kind of their complete start to finish chronological order either. So I always pick up something new and something I hadn't heard.
Sure, I'm forgetting things as the years go by too. But,
as we all do.
But
now, what was the tie to? There's a Rolling Stone. Because remember, in your office, you have a Rolling Stone.
I had in the old office. I had a cover of the Rolling Stones magazine. Rolling Stones magazine. In the year this came out, I can't even remember what year it was. They had done a big article in there, and I think they titled it "Business Arizona Style," and it was like, I don't know, Saguaro, Scottsdale, and Stripper Sisters or something. It was a catchy title. And so they had the picture. They described the failed growth hormone, ripoff. Right. And then
did we touch on the Stripper Sisters thing, or did we do that before we were talking?
Yeah, because that's how I think that because they were.
That's right. I couldn't remember if we did it on air or if we just did it off.
No, we did that on air right at the beginning.
And
again, that's just a guess right now that I believe that they were the tie to Constantine.
Got it.
And they
Rolling Stone thought so too.
Yeah, Rolling Stone. It's a good article.
Yeah.
So
what do you think
article.
Rolling Stones? What made them glom onto this story? What was the piece of it that you?
It just sounded sexy for them, I think. I mean, as in all entertainment stories or events, that whether it's press or film or TV, or, it involved life and death, and involved some rich kids, it involved some strippers, and involved, large amounts of drugs. And I mean, it just had real good talking points and enough.
A pretty horrific death.
A very horrific death.
Yeah.
A very horrific death. I mean, it was real bad. Matter of fact, I remember that the attorney that did this case, he and I would travel 4 days in a row from here to Prescott, Arizona, which is the county seat, and while we examined every piece of evidence in that case. And I still remembering there being a tin can in the county attorney's office that we opened in there to examine the contents, and it was some of Constantine's clothes that were in this can, had been in there for a year or two. And when you open up that can and the seal was broken, it's like everybody in the room just about threw up.
Oh, I can imagine.
We've been around dead bodies.
Yeah.
And the odors that are associated to some of these things are pretty horrific.
Yeah.
So I think the Rolling Stones just... It was worthy of a lot of pages in their magazine.
I mean, it's kind of like, us picking it as a topic for an episode. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. It's sad, but there's a lot of interest there.
Right. And it was no crime of passion. But it was one of these things where it just developed, and every decision that was made along the way was the wrong decision. Yeah.
Well, a little Fargo-esque. I think we talked about that as well, with the gun and with, thinking that the guy's dead with the stab and he's not. And then, like I said, you put yourself in the shoes of who's the guy that lit him on fire? McHale. You put your guy in the shoe. If the guy all of a sudden came back to life and was on fire, I don't think you'd stick around. I think you'd be running.
Run like hell.
Oh, scare you to death.
Yeah,
but I mean, it's not like the guy doesn't deserve to be scared to death. But anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway, great story. Do you have anything else to add with regard to Fossil Creek at all?
No, I think we covered Fossil Creek pretty good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, pretty good.
Perfect.
That one. I would like to add something else, though. If we've exhausted Fossil Creek.
I think so. It was a great story. Appreciate it.
Having done 5 or 6 of these with you, and they're enjoyable to do and rehash some pretty important, significant cases we've shared and I've had over the years. I get a lot of people requesting further information from me. They'll send me emails, or they'll call me and say, "Hey Jay, what about this? What about this?"
So on the stories or on something totally?
On the stories.
Okay.
But it always leads to other things. Like they have other topics, or they're like, "Hey, why don't you talk about this?" I was just wondering if you had ever opened up your inbox or solicited invitations from your listeners to ask us something, because there's probably a lot of the material you and I both have that we haven't covered, and they have access to 2 guys with a tremendous amount of experience here, where I'd love to come in here one time and just have a bowl we can draw questions out of and fire them back at one another with no preparation and just as crazy, absurd as whatever it may be. I don't know if you've ever given that some thought.
Well, I think it's a great idea. And, like we discussed before, I kind of throw it out at the end when I trail off and say, hey, if you have any questions, comments, or whatever, reach out to me. But also, you kind of gloss over that after a while as well. So I think maybe it's a great idea to really make a concerted push for it. And I'm good with that. And I think really the only medium I have is the email or Facebook.
Okay.
So either way, I think if someone does have a question like Jay's saying, reach out. Now, you call and you ask me a question about horticulture. I suppose we can give it a shot, but obviously our format.
You can give it a shot. I can't help you on that one. I can build a raised bed garden, but my wife is going to have to grow
just the fact that you
there.
mentioned raised bed garden
means
that you know more than me.
And a vertical garden. So I know more.
So
I can discuss horticulture.
Okay, so any horticulture questions, that Jay's going to take care of those. Anything else? So quasi law enforcement-y. I'm honestly too. You could actually. We'd probably be able to give some pretty good answers on the private side, the private investigation side as well. A little bit of civil. I mean, really, I guess.
Anything.
Yeah, bring it, and we'll do what we can.
I can't tell you, when people witness what took place last week at our Capitol, my phone rings and go, Jay, what happened there?
Yeah.
What went wrong, and what could have been done differently? And why did a cop back up instead of going forward? And I go, well, there are 50,000 people in front of him, and he was one guy.
Right.
And I'm always... I love to, answer questions if people are genuinely interested in whatever it is
Sure.
they want answered. And not everybody knows a cop or a PI or a retired guy. Retired guys with our experience. So I'm going to put it out to the people that that listen to this. Who I maybe don't follow you, but I forward episodes to them.
Right.
I think eventually they're all signing up to follow you. But I'm going to solicit some questions from them to see if
Thanks.
open it up, and then I'll shoot them over to you. And if you want to run them sometime, that'd be great.
I think it sounds great. It'd be kind of fun. Honestly, would be. I don't know that you could do an entire episode on it because, like I said, I just haven't had a ton of that type of material. I mean, we could. But even if you just started doing one, like at the back end, one or two at the back end of your episode,
that'd be great.
It'd be kind of fun.
It'd be great.
So, okay, well then, so there it is. So, definitely if you have a question, and the one thing you bring up the Capitol issue, huge incident, a lot of confusion. Feel free to give us those kind of questions as well, because in all honesty, I could kind of almost see like one question could really build itself into an episode, depending on, how wide it is, the subject matter. And, one thing that you and I haven't delved into too much is obviously there are going to be times when Jay and I don't agree on certain aspects or the way things are handled, or I don't know that it would be black and white, but I think it could definitely be, I wouldn't have chosen that direction. I would chose this, or vice versa.
Exactly.
No, I kind of welcome it. I think it might be kind of fun to do.
I'll come in and argue with you.
I mean, Jay's fun as it is, but I think it might be fun to have something different, with a topic.
Kind of a point counterpoint to a matter of interest, that we can answer for Jackie in Nebraska or whoever's listening to you. So I think it'd be fun and it'd be nice to answer.
I would almost say though, I don't know about traffic questions.
No, that's
because
a good
know
point.
that you get calls, you get 1,000 calls from relatives, friends of friends, and hey, I got this ticket and I was doing X, Y, and Z. We're probably not the people for that.
No, for one thing, I never liked writing tickets, and I didn't spend much time in a patrol car. I spent most of my time in special investigations, and to this day, I probably may drive on occasion a little bit faster than I should.
Possibly.
And I also know that cops will write other cops tickets because I've had one not too long ago, so it happens. So, but you're right, no traffic.
Yeah, probably not.
So
I mean, we'd always take
I'm not going to answer a crosswalk school, 15-mile-an-hour speed limit question. I won't be that guy.
Now, if you have questions about, I'm not even going to go into it. Jay knows a ton of stuff. So let's just leave it at that.
Okay.
So let's solicit those questions and we'll see where it goes.
It'd be fun.
Perfect. All right. Well, hey, I am going to wrap it up. So with that, guys, I'm going to close this episode of I Barely Got Here. Thank you for listening. And if you like the show, please subscribe and post a review or both. And ask your friends to give it a listen as well. And again, I will reiterate, if you have a question or comment or an idea for content, you can shoot us an email at ibarelyGotHere@gmail.com. Hit me up on Facebook. And in addition, you can also follow on Facebook and Instagram. With that, Sam42.
And I'll be King 410 today.
I like it. We are 10-7.